trial, Berry claimed he and the girls were attacked by someone with dark skin and dark hair, and that he owed thousands of dollars to a loan shark named Paul. But the jury didn't believe his story and found him guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder.
Neighbors, now in shock, recall seeing a family that appeared happy.
This is a family that was nice. Interactions were very minimal. The dad and kids, they seemed happy. The kids, I saw them the other day, they were playing and happy.
It was Christmas 2017 in Oak Bay, Canada. Inside the apartment at 1400 Beach Drive, the power had been completely cut off, leaving the unit in total darkness. A desperate mother stood knocking frantically on the window in vain, searching for her 2 young daughters, aged 4 and 6, who were supposed to have been returned to her by noon. When police forced open the locked door, they uncovered a blood-soaked crime scene of unimaginable horror. The 2 children lay lifeless on the bed. Their father was found gasping in the bathtub. His initial statement directed the investigation toward a violent underworld debt settlement. Yet forensic evidence and the direction of the bloodstains told a completely different story. There were no signs of forced entry from outside. Who had locked that door from the inside? The chronological initiation of this forensic investigation is set against the contrasting backdrop of December 25, 2017, in Oak Bay, British Columbia. Oak Bay is a highly affluent, picturesque seaside community traditionally characterized by its low crime rate and tranquil environment. On this specific holiday, the neighborhood of Beach Drive was heavily decorated with festive lighting and occupied by families celebrating Christmas. However, beneath this facade of seasonal normalcy, a high-stakes family court mandate was approaching a critical legal deadline. A strict temporary custody arrangement dictated that the biological father was legally obligated to return his children to their mother at precisely 12 p.m. As noon passed without the mandated physical handover, the situation rapidly deteriorated. Repeated telephone calls and text messages sent by the mother went entirely unanswered. After several hours of mounting anxiety and independent searches of local areas, the mother officially contacted the Oak Bay Police Department, initiating a formal missing persons protocol and a high-priority welfare check at the father's primary residence. Law enforcement officers were dispatched to 1400 Beach Drive as the late afternoon light began to fade, arriving at the apartment complex around 4:15 p.m. Upon approaching the specific ground floor unit, responding officers immediately identified a stark and concerning environmental anomaly. While the surrounding apartments were brightly lit and radiating heat, the target unit was completely devoid of electrical power. The apartment had been entirely disconnected from the municipal utility grid, plunging the interior into total darkness, a massive red flag during the freezing temperatures of a Canadian winter. Officers knocked forcefully on the primary door and announced their presence, but the residents remained eerily silent. The main entryway was securely locked from the inside, indicating no obvious signs of a forced external breach. Recognizing the escalating risk profile associated with a failed legal handover in a dark, unresponsive environment, Police Command escalated their tactical response to preserve the physical integrity of the primary entrance for potential forensic analysis. Officers bypassed a destructive physical breach. Instead, they collaborated with the building's property management company to procure a master spare key. Upon unlocking the door and crossing the threshold, law enforcement personnel were immediately enveloped in pitch-black conditions. This total absence of ambient light necessitated the deployment of high-lumen tactical flashlights. Officers initiated a highly methodical, room-by-room spatial clearance of the residential layout, advancing cautiously through the silent hallway to locate the primary occupant and establish the baseline nature of the emergency. This tactical sweep ultimately directed law enforcement to the apartment's bathroom, where the focal point of the active scene was uncovered. The narrow beams of the flashlights cut through the darkness to reveal a bathtub filled to the brim with water. Partially submerged within this flooded basin was a single adult male, subsequently identified as the biological father and primary resident of the apartment. A rapid preliminary medical triage executed by the officers revealed significant, acute physical trauma. The subject presented with multiple open lacerations anatomically concentrated in 2 highly specific regions the left pectoral area of the chest cavity, and the anterior region of the neck. Although the subject was unresponsive to initial verbal commands, officers noted shallow, compromised biological signs of life, including a faint pulse and labored breathing. Recognizing an immediate and critical medical emergency, the responding officers secured the immediate perimeter and rapidly radioed for advanced emergency medical services. This pivotal discovery officially transformed the operation from a standard welfare check into a secured, active forensic investigation. Following the initial discovery at the apartment, the investigative focus temporarily shifted to the local hospital, where the sole surviving adult, the biological father of the two young victims, was receiving medical treatment. Once medical personnel determined he was stable enough to communicate, law enforcement officers proceeded to collect his official statement. It was during this hospital room interrogation that the surviving man introduced an alternative narrative, presenting a comprehensive home invasion scenario to explain the fatal events. According to the chronological sequence provided by the father, the incident was the direct result of a targeted attack by an unknown external assailant. He asserted that he was walking into his bedroom when he was suddenly ambushed from behind. He provided a vague physical description of the attacker, identifying him only as a dark-skinned stranger. The man claimed that this initial physical assault was swift, incapacitating him immediately and causing him to lose consciousness on the floor before he could process the situation or defend himself. The narrative provided to the police continued with his subsequent recovery of consciousness. The father stated that upon waking from the initial assault, he dragged himself through the apartment and discovered that his children had been killed. However, his account stated that before he could take any further action or call for emergency services, he was confronted by the assailant once more. He alleged that he was overpowered by the same intruder, subjected to a second series of stab wounds, and subsequently lost consciousness for a second time, ultimately waking up in the bathtub where first responders originally located him. To establish a logical motive for this extreme level of violence, the man introduced a complex backstory involving underground criminal syndicates. He confessed to law enforcement that he was entrenched in a severe gambling addiction and had accrued a substantial illicit debt, totaling approximately $25,000. He claimed this money was owed to a dangerous local loan shark whom he could only identify by the first name, Paul. Because he possessed no financial means to settle this outstanding debt, the father alleged that he was coerced into an illegal arrangement. He claimed that Paul forced him to utilize his apartment as a temporary stash house for holding bags of contraband, which he suspected contained illegal narcotics. Based on this premise, the father theorized that the brutal home invasion was a calculated retaliation executed by the criminal gang. He suggested that the loan shark had dispatched a hitman to his residence to settle the financial dispute, framing the death of his daughters and his own injuries as the violent fallout of a narcotics-related debt collection from an analytical law enforcement perspective. Documenting the specific testimony established the primary defense hypothesis. Investigators were now tasked with systematically cross-referencing this detailed timeline, the physical existence of the loan shark, Paul, and the mechanics of the described ambush against the concrete forensic evidence secured at the crime scene. While the surviving suspect's narrative provided a highly detailed account of a violent home invasion, the subsequent forensic examination of the crime scene painted a starkly contradictory picture. In criminal investigations, physical evidence serves as an objective baseline. It does not possess the capacity to fabricate, misremember, or alter timelines. In this specific case, the systematic analysis of the apartment revealed critical physical discrepancies that immediately began to dismantle the father's intruder hypothesis. The investigation commenced with a thorough peripheral analysis of the apartment's boundaries. Crime scene technicians meticulously inspected all potential points of entry and egress, including the main door, the balcony, and all window frames. The official forensic report indicated an absolute absence of forced entry. There were no tool marks on the deadbolts, no shattered glass, and no compromised security latches. Furthermore, The egress analysis yielded a highly significant anomaly. While the interior of the apartment contained substantial blood evidence, the perimeter was entirely clean. There were no bloody footprints, shoe impressions, or transfer stains leading out of the apartment threshold or into the external public hallway. If an external assailant had executed the attack and fled the scene, basic forensic principles dictate they would have inevitably tracked biological material out of the primary environment. The total absence of an exit trail strongly suggested that the perpetrator never actually left the premises. Inside the apartment, BPA provided a spatial reconstruction of the event. The blood evidence did not reflect a rapid, chaotic hit-and-run scenario typical of a professional assassination. Instead, investigators documented an extensive drip trail and specifically identified 21 bloody foot transfer stains. Crucially, forensic analysis determined these prints were made by feet wearing socks, rather than outdoor footwear. The directional flow of these sock prints mapped a deliberate, pacing movement back and forth between the bedrooms and the kitchen area. This pattern indicated that the individual walking through the scene was unhurried and moving freely within the apartment long after the initial bloodletting had occurred. The physical evidence surrounding the weapon further undermined the suspect's claims. The murder weapon was not a foreign object brought to the scene by a hitman. It was a standard kitchen knife sourced directly from the apartment's own cutlery drawer. Forensic technicians discovered a distinct blood smear on the handle of that specific drawer, proving that the perpetrator already had blood on their hands when they opened it to retrieve the weapon. Finally, forensic pathology delivered the most definitive contradiction to the survivor's timeline. During the autopsies, medical examiners analyzed the gastric contents of the two deceased victims. The pathology reports confirmed that both victims possessed completely empty stomachs, indicating they had not consumed any food, including breakfast, that day. This biological metric established the time of death firmly in the early morning hours, scientifically estimated to be between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. This forensic reality stood in undeniable contrast to the father's official police statement, in which he adamantly claimed the alleged intruder had attacked the family in the mid-afternoon. The empirical data unequivocally collapsed the established alibi. As the investigation transitioned from the physical crime scene to the medical and psychological evaluation of the surviving suspect, the intruder hypothesis began to collapse entirely. The fourth phase of the analysis focused on glaring flaws in the suspect's alibi, systematically categorized into biological discrepancies, documentary evidence, and post-incident behavioral anomalies. Medical professionals evaluating the adult male at the hospital immediately noted a stark asymmetry between his personal injuries and the fatal reality of the broader incident. The attending trauma surgeons documented that the stab wounds on the suspect's left chest and anterior neck were highly superficial. None of these lacerations posed an immediate threat to his life, nor did they sever any major arteries or compromise vital organs. Furthermore, a biomechanical analysis of the wound coordinates revealed a precise mathematical match with the natural reach, leverage, and angle of a right-handed individual inflicting harm upon themselves. In forensic pathology, hesitation marks and shallow, grouped wounds in these specific anatomical zones are classic indicators of self-inflicted injury. This clinical data stood in sharp contrast to the extreme, unhesitating and lethal force exerted upon the young victims. The medical evidence scientifically proved that the suspect was not on the receiving end of a targeted assassination attempt. Simultaneously, crime scene investigators processing the apartment recovered a critical piece of physical evidence that further dismantled the external threat narrative: a handwritten document. Forensic document analysis confirmed this to be a suicide note authored by the suspect prior to the incident. The text within the note did not reference any fear of loan sharks, illicit cartels, or a hitman named Paul. Instead, it functioned as a calculated grievance document, The contents explicitly blamed his ex-wife and his own biological parents for his ongoing financial ruin and personal failures. Most importantly, the note clearly articulated a premeditated intention to end his own life. The existence of this document unequivocally pointed to an internal, premeditated sequence of events rather than a random home invasion. The final component of the alibi's collapse centered on the suspect's behavioral psychology. Following his surgical treatment, the suspect regained consciousness and full lucidity in the intensive care unit. During his interactions with hospital staff, attending nurses and police detectives over several days, investigators noted a profound behavioral anomaly. The suspect did not ask a single question regarding the status, location, or well-being of his two children. In victimology and behavioral profiling, a parent who has just survived a violent home invasion universally exhibits immediate, frantic concern for their offspring. The suspect's absolute silence and apathy regarding the children were psychologically incompatible with his fabricated narrative of being a victimized, protective father. Thank you for watching this forensic breakdown. If you appreciate objective, fact-based true crime analysis without the emotional sensationalism, please subscribe to the channel to support our ongoing case files. We want to hear your analytical perspective. Do you believe post-incident behavioral anomalies are as legally compelling as physical bloodstain evidence? Share your detailed thoughts in the comments section below, and make sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on our next investigation. The accumulation of forensic evidence systematically dismantled the surviving suspect's narrative. Upon completing the crime scene reconstruction and verifying the biological improbabilities of the suspect's injuries, investigators formally concluded that the loan shark, Paul, and the alleged underworld hitman were entirely fictitious constructs designed to deflect culpability. With external threats scientifically ruled out by the closed perimeter nature of the crime scene and the bloodstain pattern analysis, the investigation reached a definitive conclusion. Based on an unbroken chain of physical evidence, the sole perpetrator responsible for the fatalities was the biological father, Andrew Berry. To finalize the criminal profile, investigators shifted their focus to establishing the underlying catalysts that triggered the event, uncovering a dual motive of total financial collapse and extreme psychological retaliation. The secondary phase of the investigation relied heavily on forensic accounting. Detectives subpoenaed banking records, credit statements, and employment history to map the suspect's financial trajectory in the months preceding the incident. The data exposed a catastrophic personal ruin. Official employment records indicated that the suspect had been entirely jobless since May of 2017. Lacking a steady income, he engaged in highly destructive financial behaviors. Banking data revealed that he had prematurely liquidated his professional pension, systematically funneling the entirety of those funds into a severe and escalating gambling addiction. By the time of the incident, the financial data showed a state of absolute insolvency. His credit cards were completely maxed out, his bank accounts were severely overdrawn, and he possessed zero liquid capital. This total economic collapse culminated in the termination of his basic living utilities. Both electrical and heating services to his apartment had been disconnected due to months of chronic non-payment. While financial ruin provided the baseline stressor, behavioral analysts identified a much darker, primary psychological driver behind the lethal action, a phenomenon known in criminology as spousal revenge. The suspect harbored deep-seated animosity toward his ex-wife Sarah, stemming from their separation and the subsequent custody arrangement. He was acutely aware that the recent termination of his apartment's utilities would inevitably be discovered by her upon the scheduled handover of the children. Within the strict parameters of family court, lacking basic utilities, specifically heat and electricity, during the winter season constitutes a fundamentally unsafe environment. The suspect knew this discovery would unequivocally result in the immediate and permanent revocation of his remaining visitation rights. Facing the absolute loss of control, total public humiliation, and the finality of his financial defeat, the suspect's psychological state deteriorated into a framework of punitive retaliation. criminal profilers categorized the subsequent event as a calculated act of spousal revenge. The suspect recognized that his ex-wife's primary emotional attachment and core foundation were the children. Consequently, the extreme violence was utilized as the ultimate instrument to inflict maximum, irreparable psychological destruction upon his former spouse. The investigation concluded that the suspect executed the ultimate act of domestic violence to ensure that if he were to lose everything, his ex-wife would suffer the highest possible magnitude of loss. A comprehensive forensic review of this case inevitably extends beyond the immediate timeline of the incident to scrutinize the institutional oversights that allowed the tragedy to occur. An analysis of the perpetrator's historical behavioral data between 2013 and 2015 reveals a well-documented trajectory of escalating domestic volatility. Law enforcement and legal databases contained explicit records of the suspect's coercive and physically intimidating behavior directed at his ex-wife. Notably, official police reports documented a severe verbal threat in which the suspect explicitly stated his intention to blow up the house, demonstrating a clear capacity for catastrophic, indiscriminate violence. Furthermore, the records detailed incidents of physical assault, including instances where the suspect forcefully pinned his ex-wife to a bed, necessitating law enforcement intervention and the subsequent issuance of a restraining order. These early events established a verifiable baseline of coercive control and extreme emotional instability, serving as primary clinical red flags that were documented yet inadequately mitigated by the broader legal apparatus. The systemic failure compounded significantly when evaluating the involvement of Child Protective Services, specifically the MCFD. Institutional records confirm that during 2015 and 2016, social services received multiple alarming reports regarding the physical and psychological safety of the two young victims while in their father's custody. These reports were not arbitrary. They included empirical medical documentation of an unexplained head trauma sustained by the younger child, alongside highly concerning allegations of inappropriate physical contact. Despite the severity of these claims, the institutional response was procedurally inadequate. The subsequent investigations were formally closed without implementing long-term protective measures. The bureaucratic justification cited a lack of sufficient empirical evidence to meet the strict statutory thresholds required to secure a criminal conviction or permanently sever parental access. By rigidly adhering to the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt for basic intervention, the agency effectively dismissed the cumulative pattern of risk, leaving the vulnerable minors exposed to an ongoing, unmonitored threat environment. The ultimate systemic breakdown culminated within the jurisdiction of the family court system. During the protracted custody proceedings, the presiding judiciary was presented with a comprehensive portfolio of the suspect's behavioral anomalies, including his documented history of domestic aggression, verified financial instability, and the concerning MCFD reports. Despite the presence of these glaring psychological and environmental red flags, the court fundamentally miscalculated the perpetrator's threat assessment matrix. In a critical judicial oversight, the court mandated shared custody and granted unsupervised overnight visitation rights to the suspect. This ruling exposed a deeply ingrained systemic bias within family law jurisprudence, the default prioritization of a biological parent's legal right to access over the empirical safety and physical preservation of the children. By misinterpreting the suspect's course of control as a series of isolated, manageable conflicts rather than recognizing them as indicators of a high-risk domestic homicide trajectory, the judicial system inadvertently facilitated the perpetrator's unrestricted access to the victims, thereby engineering the exact conditions necessary for the fatal outcome to occur. During the comprehensive proceedings at the Supreme Court, the judicial process meticulously dismantled the fabricated defense hypothesis. The defense counsel attempted to maintain the narrative of an external attack orchestrated by a fictitious loan shark, presenting the defendant as a secondary victim of a violent home invasion. However, the prosecution countered this narrative not with circumstantial theories, but with an overwhelming volume of empirical physical evidence. The court was presented with definitive bloodstain pattern analysis, which documented the undisturbed, closed perimeter nature of the crime scene and mapped the precise trajectory of the bloody sock prints moving between the bedrooms and the kitchen. Furthermore, medical examiners provided expert testimony regarding the victim's gastric contents, scientifically fixing the time of death to the early morning hours, thereby legally invalidating the defendant's mid-afternoon timeline. The recovery of the defendant's heavily blood-soaked clothing, strategically discarded in the bathroom prior to his entry into the bathtub, combined with the superficial, biomechanically self-inflicted nature of his own wounds, provided undeniable proof of his direct culpability. Consequently, the court completely rejected the Truder alibi, classifying it as a physiological and logistical impossibility. Faced with this irrefutable chain of forensic data, the jury reached a definitive consensus. The court convicted Andrew Berry on 2 separate counts of second-degree murder. In addressing the extreme gravity of the offenses, the presiding judge delivered the mandatory sentence for such convictions under the Penal Code, life imprisonment. The critical judicial determination, however, pertained to the parole eligibility period. Recognizing the egregious breach of parental trust, the high degree of moral culpability, and the calculated nature of the crime, the court set a stringent minimum threshold, mandating that the perpetrator serve at least 22 years in a federal penitentiary before being legally permitted to apply for parole. The judicial process did not conclude with the initial sentencing. The defendant launched multiple legal challenges, filing formal appeals in both 2022 and 2024. These appeals argued procedural errors and challenged the severity of the parole ineligibility period. In both instances, the appellate courts conducted rigorous reviews of the trial records, unilaterally dismissing the appeals. The appellate panels ruled that the initial proceedings were constitutionally sound, and that the profound moral culpability of the acts fully justified the stringent penalty, thereby cementing the legal finality of the conviction. From a criminological and legal standpoint, this case stands as a definitive, clinical textbook example of predictable domestic homicide. The behavioral pathology exhibited by the perpetrator, characterized by escalating coercive control, financial instability, and profound vindictiveness, aligns perfectly with established risk assessment matrices for spousal revenge. The incident highlights the catastrophic consequences of judicial and institutional systems failing to accurately calculate the lethality of documented psychological red flags, underscoring the necessity for family courts to prioritize objective risk assessments over the default presumption of parental access. Furthermore, the investigation serves as a critical empirical lesson for modern law enforcement protocols. Initial suspect testimony must immediately be subjected to the rigorous scrutiny of the scientific method. The resolution of this case was not achieved through interrogations or confessions, but through the silent, immutable testimony of forensic science. By prioritizing blood spatter patterns, pathology reports, and physical crime scene reconstruction over the deceptive verbal statements provided at the scene, investigators successfully exposed a fabricated reality and secured a conviction based entirely on the absolute primacy of objective physical evidence.